Welcome back to the Daily Drum on WHUR and Sirius XM Channel 141. I'm Harold Fisher. Tonight, we have a fascinating look at Black voters, what they want, their expectations, values, hopes, and what drives Black voters to the polls. A first of its kind survey of the Black electorate was conducted back in March, and the findings were just released this morning. The survey, simply titled Black Values, looks at what's important and what the findings really mean. My guest is Dr. Katrina Gamble, researcher and founder and CEO of Sojourn Strategies. Dr. Gamble, thank you so much for joining this conversation.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Probably not even as excited as I am, because just kind of looking at the results of this survey, and I've been doing this a really, really long time, and I must say, I've not ever seen anything like this as it relates to not just Black voter participation or lack of participation, but voters in general. I mean, this is such an extremely detailed look at the Black community and its many, many branches. Kind of give me, from your perspective, an overview. How did this drill down so deeply?
Yes, I mean, that's actually exactly the reason why we did this research is because our experience is historically, people often think about the Black electorate, Black voters in particular, as if they're a monolith, and they get treated as if they're a monolith. You know, late communication, late in election cycles, the same message, as if all Black people think about and see politics as the same. But for those of us who do work in the Black community, many of the organizations that helped inform this research from across the country, from Power Interfaith, a faith-based organizing group in Pennsylvania, to Detroit Action, a youth-based organizing group in Michigan, to New Georgia Project in Georgia. These are organizations who do work deeply on the ground, and they know that our communities are not the same. They're different, and so we decided to do some research to take a step back and really understand, who are we talking to? What are the things that drive and motivate people when we think about elections and politics, but also our democracy more broadly?
Yeah. Talk about some of the key findings.
Yes. So we did this, as you mentioned, we did this survey. And one thing I want to say is, like, not only did we survey registered Black voters, so folks who are already registered and are potentially could participate, we also talked to unregistered Black voters, because for us, we thought it was important to understand the full breadth of the Black community. And what we found was that there are actually 5 different, what we call as researchers, clusters, but other folks might think of archetypes within the Black community. And that kind of tells us about some of those differences and nuances within our community. And the 5 are what we call, the first and the largest is what we call the legacy civil rights. The next one is what we call secular progressives. Another we identified is called next gen traditionalists. The fourth, which probably have been getting a lot of focus in the news lately, is what we call the rightfully cynical. And then the last archetype we identified is what we call the race neutral conservative.
Yeah, that's, I think, rightly so. We do hear a lot in media discussions about, rightfully cynical. Certainly, we know about, legacy civil rights as a general definition, and of course those who may be progressive. But when you talk about, the rightfully cynical and the race neutral conservatives, which are a part of this study, that certainly for me raised some some eyebrows, because again it goes back to what you were saying about the fact that the Black community is not, and really has not been, uh, politically monolithic in a very, very long time.
Yes, or probably ever, really, if you think about it. And I really appreciate, Harold, you noting that the legacy civil rights is probably, I always say the legacy civil rights archetype is actually probably the one that most people think about when you think about traditional messaging around politics, who people are speaking to, how they're messaging to the Black community. They're saying voting is a right that our ancestors died for. We have to show up and vote. And quite honestly, that segment of Black people already know who they're going to vote for, and they're already going to vote. And so, in some ways, a lot of the messaging that the political industry is pushing out is actually targeting the segment that needs it the least. And to your point, these other groups like the rightfully cynical and the race neutral conservatives are probably the parts of the Black electorate that are the most not understood or researched and things like that. So, for example, the rightfully cynical, a few things that would be interesting to know about them is that they are folks who they have very low levels of trust, especially of institutions and politicians. They identify as independents. They pretty much don't like either party. I mean, slightly the Democrats a little bit better, but the unfavorability ratings for both parties are low. And also they think that their vote doesn't have a lot of power to impact change. They don't think the Black community has a lot of power to impact change. So on a number of measures, they just seem and feel very disconnected and detached from what I like to say is small d democratic process. These are folks who are extremely frustrated and really on kind of the verge of just checking out of the process
Yeah,
altogether.
it sounds like it. It sounds like if they were in mixed company, you probably look at them and say, "My goodness, do you even like chocolate ice cream?" I mean, it's just, what do you like? Do you only love your mama? Because they are a cynical bunch. And while I say that tongue in cheek, that does not mean that they are not, um, uh, intellectually astute. They are hard thinkers, arguably maybe so hard where they may find or take issue with just about everything.
Yes, I mean, and actually, the reason why we named this group rightfully cynical is because of just that. This is their cynicism in many ways are justified. They have lower levels of income, lower levels of education. These are folks who are probably really living on the margins. They're the cluster that's the most second most likely to say that they've had an unwarranted negative encounter with the police. So they have had experience with the systems failing them over and over again. And so, in many ways, it's not that they're frustrated and cynical for no reason. They're frustrated and cynical because they feel very much like they've showed up, they've done some of the things that people have said, and nothing's changed. For example, I was doing a focus group earlier this year in Ohio with some of these rightfully cynical voters, and literally one of them said, you know, I show up and people say that this thing is going to change and this thing doesn't change. So why bother? So that cynicism is based in real life experience. But I will say that that doesn't mean that they're not movable. They are
Mm.
folks that we should be concerned about and thinking about ways to bring them back into civic life and more directly back into the democratic process.
The next largest group in this study of nearly 3,000 Black people is the next gen traditionalists. Who are they?
They are people who are really guided by faith. Their religion is incredibly important to them. They are also young. They're the rightfully cynical are the youngest, but they're the next youngest archetype of the five clusters that we identified. And they're individuals that actually, if you look at them, you would think that they would have a low sense of whether or not their vote has power or whether or not voting matters, but they actually think that voting matters, even though they actually have very low registration rates and they don't turn out a lot. They're a group that would like to turn out. I think they believe that voting matters, but they're not doing it in the way that you would expect them to do. And I think that's in part because this particular archetype actually they're the lowest resourced. They have the lowest level of education, the lowest income. Yeah. So these are folks who believe, especially if Black people come together, they can make a change. But they're also people who are dealing with the day-to-day struggles of taking care of their families. And so in some ways, that's probably part of the reason why they're not showing up at the same levels as you might expect, given some of the other characteristics about them.
That's fascinating to me. The smallest group, the race neutral conservative.
Yes. This group is completely different from all of the other clusters in almost every way in which you can imagine. It's majority, they're 7% of the respondents or of the Black electorate is another way to think about it. They are ideologically conservative. They are independents, but they very much lean Republican. They are individuals who, when asked like what's the cause of many of the challenges that the Black community face, they're more likely to say that those challenges are caused by individual choices versus systemic barriers. And so I kind of say the big difference between the race neutral conservatives and the rightfully cynical is that the rightfully cynical are independents and things like that because they're frustrated. For the race neutral conservative, it's an ideological choice. It's really how they see the world, and so their values move them into a much more conservative category than the other clusters. The other thing that's really interesting about this cluster is that they're more likely to identify as American than Black. So they also don't have a very high Black identity, which is why we call them race neutral.
Until a racist calls them the N-word, and then that becomes problematic. Yes, I said that. I did.
You said that. I didn't say that.
I did. I said that, and don't mind saying it. Have said it before. So, like Mike Tyson said, everybody has a plan until you get hit in the mouth. And sometimes, getting hit in the mouth is not a physical thing; it is an emotional thing. But anyway, I did not. I forgot the secular progressives.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so that archetype, that is the most educated. It's majority women. They turn out to vote almost at the same level as the legacy civil rights archetype. But the thing that's really interesting about them is that they don't really think that their vote has as much power as the legacy civil rights. So for a group of folks who turn out to vote at high levels, they still have some skepticism about whether or not their vote has power. And what we think is driving that is that this is a group of Black folks who also think that there's systemic bias and institutional racism. They think that laws and policies are one of the main reasons why Black people can't get ahead. So they're kind of skeptical of institutions, but they also still show up because they see it as one way in which they can fight back and protect their communities. So
this is just really amazing, and we've only begun to scratch the surface. I am going to take just a really short break, but we want to remind our listeners not to forget you can hear this and every edition of the Daily Drum Insight segment via podcast on WHUR.com. Of course, we will also post a link to this study on our website after 7 o'clock tonight. It is really well worth the read. The original Quiet Storm is coming up next. That's on WHUR. I'm Harold Fisher. This conversation continues on Sirius XM channel 141 in just a few seconds. Welcome back to the Daily Drum on Sirius XM channel 141. I'm Harold Fisher. We continue a fascinating conversation about the results of a groundbreaking survey of Black voters titled Black Values. My guest is Dr. Katrina Gamble, researcher and founder and CEO of Sojourn Strategies. One of the things, Dr. Gamble, that I found honestly a bit disturbing is for some of these clusters, as you put them, and you touched on that before the break, the high percentage of some who just do not or will not vote, or those who particularly did not vote in the 2020 election. Talk to me about that.
Right. So in a lot of ways, I like to say that cynicism, which may sound like a complicated word, is really about whether or not people they believe that they have power to
Mhm.
impact change. And so for a large percentage of the folks in these clusters, the reason why they haven't shown up is because they don't believe that they have power, and they don't think that showing up to vote is going to matter. But that doesn't mean that they have to stay there. Our research actually has shown that there are ways to disrupt that, not necessarily the cynicism, they'll still be skeptical of the institutions, but to disrupt it in action and show them that they can actualize their power and engage in our elections. And for the rightfully cynical, the first step is to one, acknowledge the cynicism, as we were talking about earlier. These are people who've had real lived experience with the systems failing them. So you can't gaslight them out of their cynicism. You kind of have to acknowledge the root of it and then pivot to give them real examples of how their actions and that how they have power to actually impact change. For example, those same voters that I was talking about in Ohio who said, "Oh, I don't care, nothing changes, why should I show up?" When I asked them about the marijuana legalization ballot initiative that passed in Ohio last year,
Mhm.
they're like, "Oh yeah, I voted for that and I felt powerful. That was something where I showed up and it actually made a difference." And so for this group, I would say it's not that we should see them as like hopeless and there's no way to bring them into the process. It's just how the political industry has typically been talking to them doesn't work. You have to
Mhm.
say, yes, I understand why you're cynical. And yes, here's like a clear way in which voting is a way in which you can show up for yourself and it can make a difference for you and your family.
Mhm. And I guess the other question is, did they feel powerful before they voted for the marijuana issue or afterwards? I'm kidding, but just a little levity there. But um, but in all seriousness, you you kind of led into my next question, because a lot of times when people receive phone calls or what have you about surveys, it's kind of yes, no, scale of 1 to 5, blah, blah, blah. But it sounds to me that, and you did do some of the actual surveys,
Mhm.
interviews.
Yes.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
sounds to me that it was more than that, that you got into some real conversations with some of these people. What was that like?
Yeah, so in addition to the surveys, like you said, we have actually done focus groups
Mhm.
with a number of these voters across the country, from Georgia to Michigan. Like I said, my firm specifically did some of the conversations that happened in Ohio and also Pennsylvania, and it is one for some people, the fact that we are actually asking these types of questions is incredibly different than I think most of their experiences with surveys and interactions with political research, is because we're not talking to them just about who are you going to vote for, are you going to show up and vote, what's your party ID. We're actually asking them questions about how they see the world. What are your values? What are you most concerned about? Do you think that you can impact change? If yes, like what would move you to take some action? How important is your faith? And like what? So we are asking them things that typically people don't actually talk to them about. And so, first of all, they're excited to be engaged in that type of conversation. And second, it gave us incredible insights into understanding the Black community, I think, in ways that has really never been unpacked through typical polling and political research.
Yeah. And again, and not to continue to drive this very specific issue, but I'm just going to be really, really honest. I cannot say that I've seen any survey that has been so detailed. I mean, this is just really taking a hard look at who we are. Even if you just took the word voters out, if you showed the results to someone who had never seen a Black person before, never met a Black person before, never knew that Black people existed, and you said you want to know about Black people, short of culture and music and stuff like that, but when you talk about what we think about here
Mm-hmm.
and now, and I don't think it's overstating, well, now you know a whole lot more about Black people than you probably never, other than, again, history, culture, music, etc.
Right. I mean, and that's one of the things that makes me so excited about this research is that when we share it with people, people can almost immediately imagine themselves or people that they know in which of the categories that they fit into. So, for
Hmm.
example, like my dad is most certainly a legacy civil rights. Every time I talk to him, he's been paying attention to the news. He's going to give me he's probably knows more than I do what the latest clips are around the elections. And he, no doubt, is going to show up. He's going to vote every time. He's probably going to harass his grandkids to try to make sure that they show up and vote too, right? Whereas, for example, I live here in Ward 5 in DC, and some of my neighbors, like in having conversations, are probably rightfully cynical because,
Hmm.
you know, they have the experience of government not necessarily delivering for their neighborhood. And so what I would say to my dad about the elections wouldn't be the same thing that I would say to my neighbor. And that's kind of the point of what we were trying to get at, is that we want people to look at this and be able to kind of pretty instinctively understand who these different archetypes are, who these people might be in their lives, and understand how to talk to them about elections to bring them more into this process.
I would also say, and it says in the survey and some of the other literature about this, that this was not so much about getting someone to vote one way or another.
Mm-hmm.
And you really make that point. It really is about attitudes. Do you believe that, considering the most recent changes to the presidential election, that you may have received different answers had this survey been conducted this month instead of in March?
We may have gotten some different answers on some of the questions about vote choice, I think, and some things like that. But the thing about this survey that is particularly interesting is, to your point, is that this wasn't about just, well, first of all, it definitely wasn't about trying to determine whether or not someone is going to vote for a particular candidate or campaign or
Hmm.
party. It was really about us understanding how do we help Black people fully realize their political agency and political power. And so some of the questions that we asked are things that are just standard about how people think about the world. So, how important is it for you to honor your ancestors? And if the answer is yes, like what are the ways in which you think that honoring your ancestors is important? For some, for some of the segments, like the Next Gen Traditionalists, it's about working hard. For the legacy civil rights, it's about voting. So that's not going to change one way or the other based off of who's at the top of the ticket for one election cycle to the next. And that was the point. We wanted to deeply understand how different parts of the Black community think about democracy and their role in democracy. and sure, people, some of these things can shift, and we do hope that they can shift. For example, we want the cynics to actually see that they have a role in our democracy. But a lot of the questions we asked are things that are very lasting beyond election cycles.
I remember a long, long time ago in a galaxy far, far away that Ohio, for example, was for surveys of any kind, political, consumer, whatever. Ohio was always the first choice because it was considered the most average state in the nation. And you did mention Ohio, you mentioned Michigan. What other states did this was the survey conducted, and why did you pick the state that you did?
So this research was commissioned by an organization called the Democracy and Power Innovation Fund. And
Hmm.
it's a collective of organizers and researchers like myself and funders who are invested in understanding these questions about Black political agency and Black political power. And so the survey was national, but in addition to this national survey, we also did state level research, state level surveys, and focus groups in Michigan, in Georgia, in Pennsylvania, and also in Ohio, which I already mentioned. And we're also doing work in Florida as well. And so we have done this research pretty much all across the country to kind of really dig in. And it's interesting that you said that Ohio is seen as the most average. Like one of the things that we actually learned is that the distribution of these archetypes shift depending on which state you're in. So, for example, the rightfully cynical category is much larger in Ohio than the national survey. And so that's like really important to understand because depending on where people live, how they think about the world, there may be, more segment, larger segments in one state than the other. So we wanted to make sure that our partners that are on the ground talking to people, organizing in Black communities have as much detailed information as they can have.
Mhm. And when I say average, I don't mean average as in mediocre. I mean
No, I
average
know.
as in, oh, and not for your benefit, but for our listeners, average in the sense of median cost of living,
Mhm.
income, poverty levels, education, blah blah blah, and, and having, as I said, decades ago, I briefly worked for a survey company, and that's one of the things that they always focused on. They always focused on, Ohio. And that obviously things have changed, particularly when it comes to the political landscape. But when you mentioned Ohio, you mentioned Michigan, you mentioned Florida, you mentioned Georgia. Um, how do you say battleground without saying battleground? But so that's what that's what my news ear hears. What is the thing that surprised you the most in talking to these voters and putting this survey, this study together?
I think one of the things that really surprised me, especially through some of the digging in around the rightfully cynics, is that I thought that we had to get people to be less cynical in order to get them to want to take some type of action, like voting, and that's actually not the case. So that for folks who are cynical, you don't necessarily have to convince them to be optimists and like have this deep belief in the system. You just have to convince them that they have some level of power in our democracy, and you have to just give them really tangible ways in which they can engage. And these are also folks, despite this feeling of detachment, they are people who are looking for community. So they're looking for a community of people that they can trust, and if they can be connected to that, they can actually be transformed into really engaged folks, both in voting but also kind of in our larger democratic process.
Mhm. Did you get the impression that some of those surveyed are paying attention, or that or not paying attention to issues around voting and who to vote for and just what's going on? And the reason I ask, because I'm sure you've heard that pundits often say, well, nobody really pays attention to an election even during a presidential year until after Labor Day. Is there anything that gave you any thought that that is not true, or that it is more true?
I think it's true for some. So
Mhm.
the legacy civil rights voters, 100% paying attention, probably all of the time. The secular progressives probably also paying attention to politics. The next gen traditionalists and the rightfully cynical, there are questions that we ask that make us think that they're probably paying attention to politics less. And for the rightfully cynical, actually less, just generally less interested in politics. They don't think it's something it's not something that they're particularly interested in. But I always say when people when folks in the the political pundits or political industry say that people aren't paying attention to politics, I say, well, whose fault is that? Really, it's because who is talking to these voters? For example, like I said, with the next gen traditionalists, they are individuals who actually think voting matters, but they also are folks with the lowest education and income, so they're struggling. They're thinking about taking care of their families, and because they have low voter registration rates, they're probably not showing up in people's voter files, which means no one's talking to them. And we actually know that talking to people is like one of the most direct ways in which to get them to become more engaged. And so I guess the answer to your question is yes, I think there's large segments that probably aren't deeply engaged in like tracking moment to moment of the elections. But I think that's like in part because the political industry's obsession with likely voters basically invisibilizes large segments of our community that if folks actually took the time to have conversations with them and talk to them about things that matter to them and that are deeply important to their communities, that their interest in politics could be changed.
Yeah. And also, maybe the argument could also be made that those pundits are paying more attention because that's their job, as opposed to average Americans, be they black, white, or what have you. It's not their job to pay attention. And so maybe it's not that they are paying attention less, but the pundits are paying attention more and thinking that everybody else needs to be like them.
That's fair.
Yeah,
I certainly don't expect anyone to be paying attention to the news as much as I am.
right. Or me. Or
Right.
you know, or me. Yes, there will be a quiz after this interview. Um, but so now, was there anything that gave you pause or that you found troubling?
Um, yeah, honestly, um, I do think that this growing detachment, and it's not a small number. The rightfully cynical are 22% of
Yeah, that's a large
the
number.
black electorate. It's a lot. And for me, I know for some folks who think about politics, they're like, oh, or does this mean that they're gonna turn Republican or whatever? That question may be, and I'm sure some folks are looking at that segment and thinking that. But for me, I just think if we're really for someone like me who's really concerned about how do we increase black political power and the ability of our community to drive change on things that are important to us, that's going to allow us to build a world where our families can thrive with dignity and joy. We can't have 22% of our people that are feel totally detached and removed from the process. And so to me that's like really concerning, and it's concerning enough that it's worth digging into to try to understand those folks and think about ways to bring them in. I don't think it's a segment that we should be dismissive of or ignore.
Mhm. One of the other longstanding conversations when you talk about the Black electorate, and I'm sure you've heard this, or maybe have even seen this from your father's friends. The conversation is always, well, Black people are generally conservative in their values. Um, and, and that's not a judgment, it's just statements that sometimes have been just made. They go to church, they may um, they may be pro-choice, but not for us, but we're going to mind our business if that's what you want to do, etc., etc., etc. Do you think that this survey kind of flies in the face of the generally accepted idea that Black people are conservative? And I don't mean right wing,
Mm-hmm.
but just conservative in their thinking, but progressive or even liberal in what they think anyone else should do.
Yeah, I think that this definitely goes in the face of that, in part because, to your point, right, these are usually generalizations that are made about the Black community based off of assumptions and trends that people might find. And so, sure, there are definitely folks in this survey and within the Black community who are socially conservative, um, and but I don't think in a way that people might necessarily think. So, for example, the next gen traditionalists, and I should have said this right. Part of the reason why we called them traditionalists is because they're the most religious of the archetypes, and they do have more traditional values in terms of how they think about like the Black family, the roles of men and women like within the family. But at the same time, to your point, they also are folks who are also like to say, they'll say, I don't believe in abortion, but I also don't think the government necessarily needs to be telling people what to do. And so the point of it is that for Black people, we can see the complexity, that there's
Mhm.
like gray. It's not just you're conservative, you're not conservative. But also like the legacy civil rights, right? They also are one of the clusters that are their faith is really important to them. They attend church at a high rate, not as much as the next gen traditionalists, but they're actually pretty um, progressive on a lot of the issues that we asked about in terms of like abortion, and on things around thinking about racism and discrimination. They were also similar, not quite as high as the secular progressives, but also to think that there are systemic causes to the reasons why Black people are struggling, and not to just like kind of blame it on individual choices. And so the point of it is that we are a very complex and diverse people, and how some like these like very broad measures of conservatism show up and how people think about the world is complicated.
Absolutely. And I think you really make an excellent point. I mean, when you talk about, for example, when you're talking about the marijuana thing in Ohio, yeah, you can't smoke weed in my house, but if they smoke weed down the street, that's fine. Um, no, no one is going to have an abortion in my house, but if that's what you want to do, that's fine. They may be struggling with LGBTQ plus issues in their house, but they also may be willing to say, well, love is love and you can marry who you want. I don't care. So, like you said, it's a very, very complicated issue.
Yes, exactly. And that's one of the things that like I said at the top, the reason why we did this research is that I think typically that, that Black people are, we're stereotyped, we're put into a box, people make assumptions. One Black person does this or thinks that way, all Black people are going to think that way. Even when people think about who we're going to vote for and our political agency, it's all very simplified, right? That if you put a Black person on the top of the ticket, all Black people are going to vote for that person, and that's what's driving it. And the reality is, what from doing this research is what we learned and I think it's like what many of us already knew, is that Black people are very thoughtful political agents. They have a lot of things like everyone else that's informing how they see the world, and that you can't paint our community with this like broad brushstrokes, but you really kind of have to, if you really want to understand them, you really have to kind of dig in a
Mhm.
deeper way.
Do you have an idea from your conversations and the compiling of this information into this final survey what the voters survey want?
Um, so interestingly, I mean, are you in terms of issues or just like generally what they want?
Generally, what if you could sum this up and one person you spoke to, if you could say, I want fill in the blank,
Hmm.
what is it that you could take away from this? Obviously, they would want different things, but did you get an overall sense of what a majority, no matter what cluster they were in, that they wanted from voting, from participating in the process?
Right. I mean, I would say the biggest thing is that people want to be seen, they want to be heard in a genuine way, and they want um, tangible results from showing up. Right. I think in a lot of ways, some of the things that we see showing up in this survey as disengagement or disillusionment, or even with the secular progressives as skepticism, is because of a feeling of of our government, of institutions not delivering for our people. So I think the biggest thing is that people don't want empty promises. They want what folks are saying to actually be true. They want people to deliver on what they're saying, and they want to be seen and heard and taken seriously as voters.
Mm. I'll let you have the last couple of minutes. Share with me your personal thoughts on just what has been accomplished with this survey, and whether or not this has got to be the new blueprint or the new black print, or um, yes, I have a great sense of humor for this kind of studying, because I just find it just so intellectually engaging and well thought out. But what do you think about
Well, thank you for that, Harold. Well, I am incredibly proud of this research, and I have to say I have to give a shout out to my co-author of this research, Terrence Woodbury
it? Mhm.
of Hit Strategies, and the organizations that I named, who helped contribute to these findings. And the biggest thing that I would say is, like, I feel like when we started this research, we this is research that has been in the making for 4 years. Like, the survey wasn't 4 years,
Mm.
but we did deep research in those states over 4 years, talking specifically to Black people. They weren't some oversample in a larger survey. And the reason why we did that was because we knew that sometimes we don't know what we don't know.
Mhm.
And we believe that it was important to invest in deeply understanding our people, because one of the goals of the organizations that are working on this, is to, like I said, we want to not only have Black people believe that they have power, but we want that power to be actualized. And that the way to do that is to take time listening to them, understanding them, and not making assumptions about how different parts of our community think and see the world. So I'm incredibly proud of this work. I think that it is really transformative, and I think that it can have a huge impact in the way that people go about doing their work, engaging, having conversations, not just with Black voters, but Black people in general. And so, yes, so I'm excited about it. I'm even more excited to get it out there and have more people take a look at it, and for the number of organizations that I mentioned who are putting this into the field in their work this year, and understanding the impact of that going into next year.
Mhm. Dr. Katrina Gamble, thank you so much for spending some time with us. This has been a great conversation, and good luck in your future work.
Thank you.
That is the Daily Drum for this Wednesday, September 4th. I'm Harold Fisher.